Hello, humans and more. Today we're going to talk about confidentiality, which is a very interesting topic in therapy. Yeah, it is a mouthful. So let's start. People oftentimes worry about what they can and cannot say in therapy, right? It's either they're going to be judged or they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to appear, quote unquote, like a crazy person. And so sometimes they hinder their own growth because they're not speaking up in therapy. So we're going to talk about what confidentiality means. I'm going to keep it a little broad because you want to check with your state, right? Different rules may apply in your state. I'm in Florida, but I'm going to keep it pretty much general. So this should cover most states. So that's the caveat. Please take note of that and let's start. So with confidentiality in Florida, you can tell me anything. You can tell me everything. And I have to not say anything, right? There is no judgment here. The point of therapy is to have that freedom to say what you want, to be politically incorrect, to speak freely, to vent freely, to disengage from the fear of being judged by the societal norms, and just speak your truth. Just speak your truth and enjoy that ability, because it is very rare to be able to speak your truth out loud to another human being and they are going to look at you and go, I understand. Interesting. Okay, tell me why you feel that way, right? Some level of let's dive deeper into that thought as opposed to, oh my gosh, you think, like, why would you say, that's not what this is about, right? I personally, in therapy, I don't take anything personal. I'm not affected by really much of anything that comes across. There's little that a person can tell me at this at this point in this stage in my career, that would make me, that would shock me. I used to work with abused and neglected children. I've worked with domestic violence. I've worked in the human trafficking field. I've worked with anger management. I've worked with people with severe mental health disorders. It's not much. Okay. So take that, enjoy that freedom, and know that you can say whatever you like in your therapy session, right? That is what we call, it has many names, but that is what we would call psychotherapist patient privilege, therapist client privilege. You have that freedom. Now, there are exceptions to the rules. There are exceptions, and this is what is important to take note of, right? We're going to discuss two that are pretty broad and apply in most states. The first exception is going to be what a professional mandatory reporter's requirements are with regard to confidentiality. And we're going to talk about the other exception, one of the other major exceptions, which is suicide and homicidal ideation. So suicidal and homicidal ideations. Let's start with children, right? So there's more to that title, which is child and vulnerable adult abuse. What does that mean? So as a mandatory reporter, as a professional mandatory reporter, right, that means that my profession requires me to report certain crimes. One of those being child and vulnerable adult abuse. So what is a vulnerable adult? Anyone over the age of 18 that has some sort of mental, emotional, or long-term physical disability, right? They're the intellectual disability, right? So these are what we consider vulnerable adults. Also, our elderly. Our elderly are vulnerable adults. So any type of abuse in that area, right? That could look like financial abuse. That could look like emotional abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. All of those are in that range. So I think the main question I would get with that one is, what does financial abuse look like, right? So you're the caregiver of someone and you are bleeding their account dry and you know you're wrong. You know you're wrong. You're bleeding their account dry. That is financial abuse, right? You're living off of them. You're taking advantage of their situation. That is financial abuse. That is something that I would have to report as a professional mandatory reporter in the state of Florida. The other ones, right? Neglect, physical, emotional, mental, those, I'm not going to get too deep into that one. I may cover that in a more detailed description in a different video, but that's that range. And so that also goes along with child abuse, right? Child abuse, child neglect, sexual abuse, child sex abuse. And it is possible to financially abuse the child as well, right? So it all depends. But being mindful that that is something that a professional mandatory reporter has to report. It is illegal for me not to report. So that is something there are no exceptions to that, right? Now, what that would look like, I've had this experience with a few of these calls, right? So let's say there's a report of child abuse, right? The child reports the abuse. Okay, I would sit with that child. I would explain to them my obligation, and we would make that call together, right? So I will be there with them. We can either make it together or I can make it without them in the room. It's totally up to them. I've had both situations happen, but that call has to be made. So if you are a clinician and you're hearing this and you have or suspect some type of abuse in that area, you have to report that. That is absolutely required. Also, in the state of Florida, if there's a child death and you suspect reasonably so that death could have been the cause of that abuse or some type of abuse, you are required to report that. And the reason why I kind of put that little caveat there is because death is confidential. And we're going to go into that in the next section, right? So let's roll into that because that just kind of leads us into that. So the next part of this is suicidal, homicidal ideations. It is not as cut and dry as a lot of people think that it is, right? I have a client, we'll kind of go over the confidentiality statement of like, yeah, I know you can't, in case I want to hurt myself. And I'm like, well, actually, no, that's not an automatic report. So what happens in those cases are, if I have a client that has suicidal ideations, I'm going to do an assessment with them, right? They may realize I'm doing it, they may not. I may do it in a very covert kind of way. So I'll ask them several questions to test where they are with that, right? How serious are they? Is this just a passing thought? Is there a plan? Is there a place? Is there a weapon? Is there an idea? Have things already been put in motion? All that depends if I'm going to report. So it's not just, oh, I want to hurt myself, and now I have to be like, oh, stop, I got a call, we got to get the police out here, they have to da-da-da. It doesn't work like that, okay? But that is a situation where I might have to break confidentiality, right? I have to assess the severity. And depending on how that conversation goes, that will determine what happens next. So it's not that you can't tell your therapist, I've had these thoughts. Who hasn't, right? It's not that you can't say that. And if you haven't, kudos. It's not that you can't say that. It's about your plan of action, if you have one, what that would look like. How deep is this thought? How pressing is this thought? How persistent is this thought? That depends, right? The next piece of this is homicidal ideations. What does that mean? That means your desire or willingness or urge to hurt someone else, right? And let me not say hurt, to actually unalive someone else. That specifically is what a homicidal ideation is, right? You may want to punch somebody in the face. I don't have to report that. But if you are ready with a plan of action, again, to take someone out, that's a problem. So what does that mean? In the state of Florida, we have as a duty to warn. There have been some events in Florida that has happened that has kind of heightened that lawful requirement. There are some things that have happened in Florida. There are some shootings that have happened in Florida to heighten that requirement. But basically, if you are wanting to hurt someone and you have a plan of action and you have been very steadfast in this plan of action, you have prepared things, you have written things, you have weapons, whatever it is, if I reasonably believe that you are more likely than not to hurt someone, I am lawfully required to warn that person and law enforcement. Okay? Now, there have been some changes to the law, like I said, and I'm going to have to do a little more research on this last piece, but that duty to warn that person, and there's a requirement now to inform law enforcement. I believe. Again, I'm in the state of Florida. Check your state. It may be different, right? Other states, you have a duty to notify immediately. In other states, there are different requirements. So in Florida, that is important, right? You have to have a reasonable belief that something is going to go down. And if that is the case, then yes, you warn that person and you let law enforcement know, okay? Immediately. Now, people get hung up on this, and I don't make the rules. I just follow them. I don't make the rules. If a person is already unalived, that is in the world of confidentiality, and I cannot disclose that. That's why there's that caveat of a child death, because if the person is no longer here, okay, there is nobody to warn. It's already done. I cannot disclose that. So if a person has already transitioned, I no longer have a duty. My only duty now is to maintain your confidentiality and what you tell me. That is it. That is all. Unless it is the death of a child and I reasonably suspect that their death resulted from abuse, from child abuse. Okay? From you, whoever, from you, somebody you know, whatever the case is, that is when I would have to report that death. But if it is another situation, I am confined to the rules of confidentiality and I cannot say anything, or I would get in trouble, or I could get in trouble. I have to maintain that confidentiality. So I know it can be a little tricky and people kind of look at me like, what? But that is, I don't make the rules. I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you what the rules are. I'm telling you what the rules are, and I'm telling you what the exceptions are. And I want you to take note again that it depends on your state, and there are other exceptions out there. So do your research. Make sure you ask your therapist questions. Make sure you get the information, because you want to feel as comfortable as possible to say whatever it is that you need to say. Now, here's one more caveat. And I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it. But if you have an adult that you're working with, or if you are an adult and you are in your therapy session and you report that you were a victim of child abuse, and you disclose who the person was, I'm not required or mandated to report, right? That decision is up to you. If the person is someone that you know, an uncle, an auntie, whatever, a parent, a family member, whoever, a stranger, whoever, and you report that you yourself was a victim of child abuse, and you are now an adult, I'm not required to disclose that, but you can disclose that if you'd like to the child abuse hotline. And I'm more than happy to sit with my clients through that process. And because it can be scary at all ages. It really doesn't matter how old you are, right? Because you're reporting for that child in you that experienced it. And that child that's inside of you that experienced it, younger you, is still very traumatized. So never be ashamed to report that if you want to. You don't have to, but I personally think that it is beneficial to report it, because who's to say that that adult has not gotten away with that with other children and they're not still doing that with other children. But, again, at that point, it's up to you. So that is a very brief look into confidentiality and how that works. Also, another thing I will say for clinicians, right? Because another thing that I get from my clients is when I take notes. Personally, I always take very vague notes. Vague notes. I keep it very short, very sweet, very simple. And there's a reason for that. So we can be subpoenaed by the law, by the courts. We can be subpoenaed by the courts to testify in court, right? Now, there are situations where a client may want me to testify for them on their behalf, and there are situations where they may not want me to testify on their behalf. I cannot disclose anything without the client's permission, unless I am summoned to do so by the court of law. Now, with that being said, I'm not saying I do this. I'm just saying. With that being said, if I'm ever required in the court of law to disclose client information or something about a session, I'm not saying I do this, but I see many people personally and professionally. I can't remember everything. So if that happens, I would simply say, okay, I would first decline. And upon the judge's requirement for me to speak without being held in contempt of court, I would then say, what I just said.
I see many people in my personal and professional life. Please refer to my notes on the date in question for any information you are seeking.
Right? So now, if they go back to my notes on that day and see that I put something extremely vague, right? It's not this detailed. Client said this, and then that happened, and this happened. Da, 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 da. It's vague. It may say, therapist.
Is that a client at the office? Therapist and client discuss their past week. Therapist and client discuss ways of reframing negative thoughts. Client concluded the session feeling refreshed.
Period. They may say, hey, this doesn't answer our question. We don't understand what this means. Can you give us more detail? And all I can do is say, again, I see many people. Please refer to my notes. What is in my notes is all that I remember from that situation. That is a way. I'm not saying I would do that. I'm saying hypothetically, but that is a way to protect your clients in those kind of situations. It's something to take note of. Now, I think we've discussed a good amount. Do your research, talk to your therapist, ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and enjoy your therapy session. Enjoy the freedom of anonymity and the ability to speak freely. Okay? Have a great rest of your day. Until I see you humans later, peace and prosperity.